Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the pestilence-stained streets and suffocating haze of medieval Europe, where plague doctors donned beaked masks and carried miasma traps like walking warnings of death. Forget the sanitized hospitals and protective gear you see today. In reality, plague doctors strode through rotting alleyways armed with little more than dead chicken beaks stuffed with herbs, vinegar-soaked pomanders swinging at their belts, and a prayer that the devil's breath would steer clear of them. So tonight we're asking why it sucked to be a medieval plague doctor, and more, where every patient's cough could cover you in contagion, every remedy could kill instead of cure, and every step could be your last. Each town had its own terror, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always chilling to see whose nightmare street we wander tonight. Now light your beacon, steel your stomach, and let's unlock the secrets of plague doctors together. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the pestilence-stained streets and suffocating haze of medieval Europe, where plague doctors donned beaked masks and carried miasma traps like walking warnings of death. Forget the sanitized hospitals and protective gear you see today. In reality, plague doctors strode through rotting alleyways, armed with little more than dead chicken beaks stuffed with herbs, vinegar-soaked pomanders swinging at their belts, and a prayer that the devil's breath would steer clear of them. So tonight we're asking why it sucked to be a medieval plague doctor and more, where every patient's cough could cover you in contagion, every remedy could kill instead of cure, and every step could be your last. Each town had its own terror, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always chilling to see whose nightmare street we wander tonight. Now light your beacon, steel your stomach, and let's unlock the secrets of plague doctors together. You stand at the edge of a dimly lit street as a figure approaches, cloaked head to toe in oilskin. Its hat is broad and stiff. Its eyes gleam behind round glass lenses. A curved beak juts from its face like the bill of a bird of prey. This is the plague doctor's costume, an ensemble designed to ward off the invisible threat of the Black Death. Yet for all its theatrical horror, it offered little real protection against the disease that swept through Europe in waves of terror. At the heart of the costume sits the mask. Crafted from leather or waxed canvas, it covers the entire face. Two round glass openings at eye level allow limited vision. Straight below them, a hollow beak extends 8 to 12 inches in front of the wearer. Inside that beak, plastered herb pockets hold a mixture of dried flowers, roots, and spices. Common ingredients included rose petals, hyssop, lavender, cloves, and myrrh. These fragrant botanicals were meant to purify the air. The prevailing miasma theory held that foul air carried disease, so a noseful of sweet aroma was thought to act like a filter. In reality, it did nothing to stop the Bacillus Yersinia pestis carried by fleas, or to block the droplets of pneumonic plague. The long leather gown reaches nearly to the ankles. It is often described as a coat of boiled leather or heavy fabric treated with wax. This created a barrier against bodily fluids and against flea bites to some degree. Underneath the cloak, the doctor wore breeches and a doublet of similar oilcloth. Gloved hands gripped a wooden cane, its polished surface worn smooth by constant use. The cane served multiple purposes. It allowed the doctor to point at afflicted skin without touching the patient, to lift lids or limbs, to ward off desperate victims, and to keep distance from crowds. Its existence underscored the fear of proximity. Boots bound the feet in the same fashion as the gown and gloves. They were high and sturdy, often made of leather treated in animal fat to repel water and vermin. A wide-brimmed hat sat atop the mask, identifying the wearer as a medical professional rather than a common charlatan. That hat also shielded the eyes from stray droplets and discouraged rats from dropping directly onto the head. Yet no part of the attire prevented fleas from crawling beneath the garments or from slipping through cracks. At best, the costume offered a few hours' reprieve from biting insects. The myth of miasma dominated medieval medicine. Scholars believed that disease arose from corrupted air emanating from swamps, rotting corpses, or overcrowded tenements. They spoke of poisonous vapors that poisoned the blood. Smells of vinegar and crushed herbs were thought to neutralize those vapors. Plague masks with their beaks of aroma were as much talisman as protective gear. They served to reassure both wearer and onlooker that something was being done against the plague. In truth, the strong scents only overwhelmed the doctor's senses, leaving him ill-prepared to face the actual means of transmission. Behind the perfume pockets lay an astonishing lack of scientific understanding. Doctors commissioned to work during epidemics received no formal training in sanitation or contagion. They relied on classical texts and the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates. When plague arrived, cities appointed these physicians regardless of their expertise. Any learned man with a degree from a local university could don the mask and charge a fee. Thus, the patchwork of beaked figures filling the streets did little to stem the tide of death. Maintenance of the costume offered its own hazards. After each visit to an infected household, the mask and gown were flung onto the floor of a cold attic or a stinking cellar for months until the next outbreak. No one thought to disinfect them beyond bathing in perfumes or fumigating with incense. Leather hardened and cracked in sunlight, and moisture rotted the cloth. Glass lenses became smeared with grime. Each reuse spread pathogens rather than containing them. Doctors might don the same garments during separate waves of plague, carrying infection from one patient to another like unwitting couriers of death. Despite these fatal flaws, the beaked costume endured for centuries. Its silhouette became an icon of pestilence. In woodcuts and paintings, plague doctors stand tall before crumbling walls or alongside carts loaded with corpses. Their presence alone could sap morale. Villagers fled at the sight of the cloak and mask, certain that the doorbell meant death awaited within. The mask's bird-like shape rattled superstitious minds. Some believed plague doctors to be agents of the devil, and riots sometimes drove them from town squares. In the end, the beaked costume represents the tragic intersection of earnest fear and medical ignorance. It speaks to a time when sight of a 16th century surgeon in full plague gear meant hope for some and terror for all. The doctors knew they were vulnerable despite the herbs stuffed in their beaks. They crossed themselves before each house and recited prayers for protection. They carried a crucifix or holy medal beneath the cloak, yet many died anyway, victims of the very pestilence they sought to heal. So tonight, as you tuck the story of the plague doctor into your memory, remember that the bright scent of hyssop and rosemary meant nothing against the true agents of disease. The beaked mask may have blocked some chills of fear, but it could not stop the chills of death that swept Europe again and again. In those dark streets, no costume, no matter how strange or solemn, could save a man from a world undone by contagion. You press your palm against the beak and breathe in the fragrant mix of rose petals and frankincense. You hope that sweet smell keeps death at bay. In medieval thought, disease came from corrupt air of swamp or sewer of battlefield or of crowded town. This foul air was called miasma. Doctors believed that if they could filter out the bad air with sweet scents, then the body could stay healthy. Thus they filled the beak of their mask with herbs that they hoped would fight off plague and fever. The miasma idea began with ancient scholars. They saw that people who lived near foul marshes fell ill more often. They blamed unseen vapors that rose from rotting matter. To them, illness was not in the body, but in the air. In each new epidemic, they rushed into the streets with covered faces and aromatic pouches. They wore long robes coated in oil to repel moisture and to keep the taint of miasma from clinging to their skin. Yet their beliefs had no clue about the real cause of plague. Small rodents carried infected fleas that hopped to humans. Once inside a body, the plague bacterium grew and turned blood to poison. No perfume could halt that process. The beak held only scent, and could not stop a flea from biting through the gap at the eye or creeping into the sleeve of the robe. Doctors who left the smell of flowers in their nostrils still died at the same terrible rate as their patients. In one city, a doctor wore the full ensemble for 10 days straight. He treated dozens of victims and paraded through the worst streets at every hour. Each morning he lit incense by his feet and concentrated on the flow of air through his mask. When the plague wave moved on, he removed his mask and found red welts along his neck and wrists. He tore away the robe to reveal flea bites under his sleeves. He collapsed before he could say a prayer and died with the carved wooden stick still in his hand. Beyond fleas, there was the problem of droplet spread. Plague in its pneumonic form passed from person to person through cough and spit. A doctor who leaned in close to listen to a patient's chest did so surrounded by clouds of infective spray. No mask of leather or canvas could block those tiny droplets. The beak might catch a whiff of spoiled orange or mastic gum, but it could not stop fluid from lodging in the lungs of the wearer. Doctors learned too late that scent offered only a false shield. Herbs themselves could carry danger. Lavender and myrrh might match the miasma theory, but they also attracted bees and small insects. Those insects brought bites and stings that inflamed wounds. Cloves and cinnamon bits nestled in pockets near the nose, sometimes molded in damp heat. Doctors found black spots in the material that signaled fungal growth. The very herbs meant to save life instead fostered mold spores that entered the lungs with each breath. The mask also let in air from underneath. When a doctor turned his head, the curved edge of the beak shifted and allowed a current of damp air to flow across the face. No strap held the mask tight enough to seal out that draft. Some doctors tied ribbons at ear level, but that only made the weight of the mask press harder against the cheeks. They removed the ribbons and tried a cloth at the neck, only to find it soaked in rain and sweat. The final result was a mask that smelled of vinegar, but could not seal out the breath of death. Ceremony masked the floors. Townsfolk marveled at the sight of the doctor, gliding past in his black robe and goosebill mask. They saw the doctor as one who battled disease with tools of magic and science. They hailed him as their savior. When nearby priests prayed for rain to wash away the miasma, they did not know that crowning cures of nectar and bloodletting had no bearing on survival. The ceremony gave hope until the plague struck within days. After each wave of plague, cities held councils to improve the mask. Masons were tasked with carving mask shapes from porous clay. Artisans tried blowing glass to fit the nostrils. None of these creations lasted. Clay cracked and glass fogged. Each test ended with cracked leather and broken limbs. Doctors returned to their old beaks of leather and pored over books for fresh theories. When no new theory arose, they wrapped scarves around their necks and prayed that God would spare their souls. In private, some physicians admitted the mask was a farce. They met behind closed doors to discuss new ideas about contagion. A few argued that sickness might reside in bodily fluid rather than in air. They suggested boiling water to wash wounds or to bathe the skin. These radical thinkers were called heretics. Town leaders exiled them or forced them to stand masked in public to test their own cure. When those doctors fell ill, they were burned at the stake as witches. By the 17th century, some plague doctors began to carry wooden canes with attached cloth rags. They dipped those rags in vinegar or in wine before tying them at their noses. Those doctors found that the wet cloth provided slight cooling and retained a pungent scent, yet the infections continued to spread among them. They tried adding camphor oil or juniper berries. Many laughed at the notion of bottles of perfume as armor against a disease born of flea and blood. At last, modern medicine unveiled the true culprits: bacteria and the fleas that carried them on rodents that thrived in crowded cities. By then, the plague mask had faded into legend as a symbol of fear. It remained a reminder of how little was known about contagion and how quickly people grasped for false comfort. The scent of herbs in a leathery chamber taught the hard lesson that fear will dress itself in costume when it must face the unknown. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, keep that image in mind. The beaked doctor once seemed a figure of hope, but proved powerless against the true agents of disease. No perfume, no cloak, and no mask could shield a man from the bite of a flea or from the breath of his neighbor. That is why miasma theory failed, and why the plague marches on in memory as one of history's darkest lessons in medical error and human hubris. You shoulder your long wooden staff and step into the fevered haze of the plague ward. In your pouch you carry jars of ointment, vials of colored oils, and a small pot of powdered herbs. At your side hangs a row of jars with dark glass lids inside which leeches writhe. These are your instruments against the pestilence, yet each one will prove a failure in the face of a disease that stalks on flea and rodent, rather than on miasma or bad humors. The staff or cane serves first as a means of distance. You use it to tap the fevered wrist of a sweating victim, or to lift a gangrenous garment sleeve without touching the flesh. You sweep it across clothing to prod a fevered body into revealing its secret symptoms. At times you brace it on the floor and lean your weight against it as you catch your breath between grim visits. The cane lets you look the sick in the eye without drawing contagion against your own breath, but it cannot keep the disease at bay when fleas crawl unnoticed along the shaft. Healing salves come next. You mix crushed flowers of marigold and lavender with rendered fat until a pale yellow balm forms. You pack it into small jars and smear a smear of the mixture onto the boiling buboes of the plague. The salve cools the burning flesh and calms the itch, but it cannot slay the infection hiding in the lymph nodes. You reapply the ointment day after day, yet the sores grow larger and the poison burrows deeper. The salve soothes only surface pain, while the fever rages beneath. In another jar, you carry a thick paste of crushed violets and honey vinegar. You believed it would draw out toxins from the flesh. You press it onto the inner arm where the pulse runs and let the victim wear it like a bracelet. They tell you the paste stings like nettle against tender skin. You hear cries of relief when the burn distracts from fever, yet the poison moves onward through the body like a river, ignoring every dam you build with herb and oil. Leech therapy holds a special place in your kit. In lean times, you fill the jar with water and drop in 6 bloodletters you gathered from the pond outside the city walls. You place a leech on the forearm of a gaunt patient and watch as its slender body swells with blood. You draw it off once it releases with a soft crackle. You believed that reducing the blood would lessen the fever of the body, yet each bite opens a fresh wound that invites new infection. Some leeches carry their own parasites from pond to flesh. You clean the bite with vinegar, but the man still dies with his veins empty and his body shriveled. Another jar holds a strong solution of crushed garlic and scurvy grass. You offer it as a tonic to stave off the deficiency of fresh food. Patients taste its bitterness and spit on the floor. A few claim that their gums stop bleeding and their joints grow easier in the morning. Yet most suffer scurvy and collapse before the cure can take hold. No herbal cocktail survives the endless rations of stale bread and moldy vegetables that plague doctors cannot control. You carry a slender glass flask of aqua vitae distilled from wine and herbs. You pour a thimbleful into the palm of a trembling patient and bid them sip. They swallow with shaking lips, as though tasting liquid gold. Their eyes flutter at the heat in their chest. Yet alcohol thins the blood and can worsen the fever. It dries the throat and steals what little moisture remains in their body. When you return the next day, the flask is empty and the patient lies dead on their cot. A set of knives and probes sits sharpened on your table. You test each on a scrap of leather until the blade slices smoothly. You learn to lance buboes at just the right angle to let pus drain without cutting a vein. The practice cost you 3 trips to the surgeon yourself until you gained confidence. Yet each incision opens a doorway for fresh plague bacilli to enter the bloodstream. No matter how expertly you cut and cauterize the wound, the disease laughs at your craft and spreads beyond the margin of your blade. A brush made of boar bristle lies next to a bowl of soapy water. You believed that friction and simple cleanliness could slow contagion. You scrub the skin of your patients as best you can, washing away layers of sweat and filth. Their skin becomes raw and sore from the effort, but they tell you they feel cleaner for a moment. Then the next wave of fever breaks, and you realize that water alone cannot wash away the invisible enemy lurking in every cell. In one small vial, you carry an oil infused with rue and mint. You dab a drop behind each patient's ear and chant a short prayer. You believe that rue warded off evil spirits and that mint would keep the breath of devilish pestilence at bay. Some patients claim dreams of better health. Nurses whispered that you fought nightmares rather than plague itself. In the end, you used the vial only on yourself to gather courage before each round. A final tool sits folded beside your boots. It is a small bit of iron shaped like a ring. You slip it on your middle finger and rub it as you talk to the dying. A verse of rue stuck in the ring was said to keep unclean air away. Yet the poor charm shattered one night when rain leaked through your cloak. The iron rusted and fell to pieces on the floor. You gathered the fragments into a pouch and placed them over your heart. The legend said that the talisman would protect your spirit. It failed to save your life. Each tool of the trade embodied hope bound in wood, glass, clay, or flesh. You carried them like a shepherd tending his flock. You heard the cough of plague and marched forward into each house. You probed the sores and removed your cane only when the sun set. Yet these instruments never halted a single death. They could not cure plague, because plague thrived in rodent fur and in flea bites. They could not purify air or strengthen blood when the true enemy lurked where they least suspected. Tonight, as you rest by candlelight, consider the cost of ignorance. The plague doctor's kit looked impressive in theory, but failed in the face of reality. It brought comfort for a moment, but offered no cure. In the end, the staff and the jars and the beaked mask could not save the man who carried them. Only time and the slow march of science would reveal how little these tools had done, and how much more the world would need to learn. Even the most elaborate concoctions and devices could not halt the march of pestilence. Bloodletting remained a cornerstone of treatment. Doctors opened veins with lancets or used cups to draw blood from the arm. They believed that removing impure blood would restore balance to the body's humors. In practice, each session sapped strength and left patients weakened. With their blood volume reduced, they grew faint and collapsed. Their immune systems, already taxed by fever, found no reservoir of vitality to draw upon. Cupping glasses offered a variant of bloodletting. A cup heated over flame was placed on the skin, then allowed to cool. As the air inside contracted, the cup drew blood to the surface. Doctors moved cups across the back and shoulders until the skin brimmed with bruises. Patients left with painful welts and open sores that invited secondary infection. No doctor suspected that plague bacteria had already spread deep into the lymph system. By the time glass cups revealed discolored skin, the patient's fate was sealed. Theriac held legendary status. This complex antidote traced its origins to ancient times and contained dozens of ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, and spices from distant lands. A small dose was recommended thrice daily to ward off poison. Yet Theriac was costly to produce. Local officials seized supplies for munition funds and sold the rest to apothecaries who watered down each batch. Patients ingested oily paste that numbed the throat but could not kill plague. Many vomited the mixture and lost even more vital fluid. Mercury-based ointments promised miraculous cures. Doctors rubbed a salve of mercury sulfide into the skin or applied mercury to the gums. They believed the metal would purge toxins through salivation. In reality, mercury burned tissue and caused kidney damage. Patients salivated until their mouths bled. Their teeth loosened. They suffered tremors and mental confusion. None of this slowed the plague bacterium. Yet many believed mercury cures superior to simple herb teas. Smoke fumigation was another widespread ritual. Doctors burned juniper, rosemary, and dried animal dung in braziers placed in doorways and in windows. They waved the smoke around each patient to chase away foul vapors. The rituals carried a pleasing aroma until embers fell to the floor. Smoke inhalation left patients coughing and wheezing. They choked on acrid fumes in a chamber already laden with miasma. Their lungs took 2 mortal blows in a single breath. Leeches, too, were often reused without thought of sanitation. A single jar held creatures collected from foul ponds. Doctors misjudged how many had fed to fullness, and which still harbored disease. When a jar went weeks without cleaning, leeches turned into carriers of hidden infections. They passed blood from patient to patient. In each bite, they worked both as a remedy and as a vector for plague or for septic wounds. Some doctors embraced quack remedies in desperation. Powdered toads crushed in wine, ground beetles mixed with honey, powdered human skull sold as ossifraga. These treatments reflected faith in sympathetic magic. A patient who survived attributed healing to the curative power of skull dust. Many more died. Each death reinforced the belief that plague was divine punishment and that only divine mercy could save a lost soul. Human remedies failed to alter the outcome. In a few towns, a physician installed a well for fresh water and forbade entry of unwashed bodies. He taught boiling water for cups and for washing hands. His patients showed lower rates of waterborne illness, yet he was shunned for contradicting miasma doctrine. He faced threats of excommunication for denying the power of royal ointments. His experiments with cleanliness pointed the way to future hygienic practices, but did nothing to curb the plague's cruel grip in his lifetime. Ultimately, medieval tools of the trade could not match the cunning of a bacterium carried on fleas that hid in rat fur. No herbal smoke, no salve, no leech treatment, nor blood purge could touch the infection at its source. Each remedy offered comfort or diversion, but failed to change mortality rates. Doctors learned too late that plague demanded not ritual, but science and sanitation. Their tools became relics of a time when fear soared higher than knowledge, and when hope rested on the petals of a rose rather than on the shield of understanding. You stand in the shadow of the city gates, as the tolling of church bells sounds the hour of plague. In medieval minds, disease arose from poisoned air, or the wrath of God. Scholars spoke of miasma that steamed from swamps and marshes. They blamed corrupt vapors that carried pestilence from rotting carcasses or from overloaded privy pits. Doctors warned townsfolk to avoid damp docks and foul sewers. They carried no masks or robes, yet poured vinegar into the street drains and burned bundles of herbs to chase away the unseen poison. At the same time, theologians preached that plague marked sin and moral decay. They claimed that the Black Death was divine punishment visited upon unworthy souls. Priests marched through the streets chanting prayers and flogging their own backs in public penance. They drove naked penitents before them, believing that flagellant suffering might appease heaven's anger. Town councils mandated days of fasting and repentance, yet each act of contrition did little to turn away the invisible scourge. Astrology offered another answer. Learned men charted the positions of the planets and consulted star charts to predict when the next wave would strike. They claimed that certain alignments of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars released poisonous influences on the Earth. A conjunction high in the sky could make spring winds fatal, or could spark sickness in sleeping children. They sold astrological charts to merchants and to nobles in hopes that knowing the hour of danger might save a few lives. In fact, no chart could trace the path of a flea or reveal the bite of a rodent born on the waterfront. Some believed that Jews had poisoned city wells to lay blame on Christians. Rumors of deliberate plots ran faster than the disease itself. Mobs gathered in town squares and set fire to Jewish quarters. Entire communities were massacred in brutal reprisals. Survivors fled into exile. These acts of violence offered gruesome proof that hatred never cured plague. The disease only moved on, unchecked by blood vengeance, and more deadly than any blade. Behind these beliefs lay no understanding of real transmission. The plague traveled on rodents and on fleas. Black rats infested ships and carts. Fleas hopped from rat fur onto human skin whenever they sensed warmth. A single infected flea, needed only to probe once to pass the bacterium into the blood of a farmer in his field or of a merchant in his shop. In crowded alleys, fleas moved from coat to coat with ease. Blood-to-blood contagion spread invisibly as families cared for the sick. Pneumonic infection spread by cough and by spit. A cough in an enclosed room could launch droplets heavy with plague directly into the lungs of a neighbor. Symptoms began days after the bite. A chill ran along the spine. The victim shivered despite the sun high in the sky. Fevers rose with blistering heat. You might see a dark blotch on the chest as shallow as a fingertip or as large as the palm. In the groin or under the arm, a bubo appeared as a swollen gland. These buboes pulsed with pain. They grew until the skin stretched tight and blue. A single touch sent waves of agony from the finger to the shoulder. Within hours, more buboes could form in the neck and behind the ears. Some patients developed the malignant form known as septicemic plague. In this case, the infection spread directly through the bloodstream. Victims bled from every orifice. Black spots broke out on the face and on the limbs like dreadful bruises. The skin could turn gangrenous and slough away in advance of fever. Death came often within a day of first symptoms. No leech or poultice could stop the poison flowing in the veins. A smaller number suffered pneumonic plague in its primary form. The lungs filled with fluid. Patients coughed and spat blood. Breathing became a struggle that rattled the chest like broken wood. They gasped at every breath. Crowds avoided the coughing man in the market. Guards threw a cloth over his head and ejected him beyond the city walls. Isolated and alone, he succumbed within hours. Pneumonic forms spread from person to person without fleas. A public sneeze in the street proved as fatal as a rat bite in the home. Treatment for these symptoms followed the same ancient regimen: purge the humors and balance the body. Doctors bled patients at dawn. They cupped and leeched. They administered clysters and castor oil to cleanse the bowels. They said that black bile and yellow bile rose in the body and clogged the humors. Bloodletting might stave off fever, but proved deadly when a man lay too weak to lose more fluid. Many patients bled to weakness or fainted during the purges, leaving them unable to survive the true burden of the disease. Cauterization offered a brutal alternative. When buboes grew too large, surgeons pressed red-hot irons to the neck of the sore. Flesh charred and crackled. Flames rose from the wound in sizzling smoke. Some men cried tears of relief, believing that fire drove the poison back into the ground. Instead, they lost the tissue surrounding the gland and faced months of infection and scarring. Death from infection after a cautery far outpaced any chance of cure. In the end, medieval sufferers faced a grim calculus: pray for divine mercy and hope that the wave would pass, hide from the miasma and carry rue in the beaked mask, chant scriptures and scourge the flesh, burn incense or draw blood or cauterize flesh. None of these efforts altered mortality in any appreciable way. The plague moved on relentlessly. Patient zero passed the pathogen onward in every cough and in every scratch of the flea. As you drift towards sleep, consider these facts. Medieval minds wrapped in robes and masks sought answers in air and in sin and in stars. They could not know that small creatures and small bacteria carried the seeds of destruction. Symptoms from buboes to bleeding lungs spelled only one outcome for most victims. No chant, no treatment, no mask could transform the plague's course. In that darkness of fear and ignorance, the disease seemed a curse of creation itself. Only centuries later did science reveal the truth hidden behind miasma and myth. You watch a merchant ship unload its cargo along the crowded wharf. Burlap sacks of grain line the deck. Rats slip among the bundles and leap to the dock in search of scraps. Within weeks, those rats vanish into the narrow lanes of the town. Soon after, the first cases of plague appear. Medieval observers noted this link, but could only curse the vapors rising from cart and quay. The disease likely began with fleas clustered beneath the thick fur of black rats. These rodents thrived aboard ships and along caravan routes. Fleas hopped from rat to rat until one found a human host. The flea's bite introduced plague bacteria beneath the skin. Victims felt only a sting at first. Then days later, their fever rose and the pain in their groin or armpit blistered into a bubo. Trade routes became pipelines for the disease. Silk Road caravans carried cloth and spices from east to west. Each caravan host camped by rivers and springs. Rats followed the wagons as sure as dust. When spring rains flooded camps, they sought higher ground in village barns. With each advance of the convoy, new outbreaks flared in distant towns. Season affected the spread as well. Hot, dry summers drove rats into storage cellars in search of water. Fleas bred rapidly in the heat. Townsfolk recorded that waves of plague peaked in late summer. In winter, colder weather cut down on flea survival, but damp housing forced people indoors. Fires burned for warmth, yet did nothing to counter the invisible bacteria dancing on body and cloth. Within city walls, sanitation failed. Open sewers flowed through streets. Garbage piled in alleys. Privy pits overflowed after rain. Doctors wrote that miasma rose from waste and stank of death. Yet the true threat lay unseen in the cracks and in the seams of clothing. Fleas emerged wherever rats could hide and ignored the incense and vinegar pumped into the air. Civic leaders tried quarantine measures to halt the tide. In some ports arriving, ships were ordered to anchor for 40 days before unloading cargo. This practice gave us the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta. Travelers from plague-stricken areas were forced to remain on board or in isolated houses. Yet enforcement was uneven. Bribes greased the process. Many ships slipped past vigilant guards under cover of night. Specialized plague hospitals, called lazarets, appeared near ports or on islands in the lagoon. Here the sick were kept apart from the healthy. They wore simple gowns and were tended by a small staff. Yet food and water for the patients came from the city. Rats and fleas rode the supply boats and spread the plague among those inside. The isolation offered symbolic hope, but spread death within the walled enclosure. Cities began to compile bills of mortality to track the toll. Parish clerks noted the names of the dead and their causes on wooden boards. London's first printed mortality rolls date to the mid-16th century. These lists helped authorities see patterns. They spotted peaks and valleys in death counts and tried to link those to festivals or fairs. Still, they remained blind to fleas and bacteria. Mortality soared. In some towns, half the population perished within months. Case fatality rates exceeded 60% for bubonic plague. Pneumonic plague claimed nearly all those infected and could kill within 2 days of symptom onset. Entire families vanished within a single week. The surviving remnants stood in haunted silence amid empty streets and shuttered houses. Why did these measures fail? Medieval authorities lacked knowledge of germ theory. They could not see the flea nor the bacillus. They relied on prayer and penance, and on rules drawn from ancient texts. When those failed, they turned to cruelty. Women accused of witchcraft were drowned or burned in hopes of cleansing the land. Such acts added grief and terror, but did nothing to slow the epidemic. In the end, the plague abated only when rat populations crashed from the sheer loss of hosts. With fewer rats, the fleas either perished or searched for new hosts among the survivors. Villages emptied of people became inhospitable to the disease. Over time, survivors developed partial immunity, yet the cycle returned again and again for centuries. Tonight, as you lie in bed, imagine the wheel of commerce spinning from port to town to village. Picture the rats slipping in the dark and the fleas jumping through folds of cloth. Sense the futility of street fumigation and the terror of quarantine walls. Remember that medieval Europe faced a foe neither they nor their priests nor their scholars could name. Only later would science reveal the true vectors and teach the world how to guard against contagion. You sling your staff over your shoulder and step into the pale dawn light. Your robe of oil-treated cloth swishes against your legs as you begin your daily rounds. Each morning you leave the safety of the lazaret gate and walk the narrow lanes between shuttered houses and fresh graves. The air carries both the scent of damp stone and the faint smell of vinegar from last night's fumigation. Every breath you take reminds you of the stakes. One misstep could bring a scratch of infected cloth or the close breath of a cough that spreads contagion. Your first visit is always the same. A small cottage with its windows nailed shut and a painted circle on the door. That is the sign that plague has struck inside. You knock 3 times with your staff and step back. Moments later, you hear the rasp of a shutter being slid aside. A trembling hand extends a bowl of water through the gap. You tip your staff to catch a dribble and drop it into your gourd. You glance at the scrawled plea beneath the circle, the name of family and the number of victims. You record it on your tablet. Then you move on to the next house. Between each stop, you pass the quarantine walls erected by the town council. Tall wooden boards fixed to stout posts block alleys and divide neighborhoods. Guards stand at spaced intervals with orders to turn away any who fail to show a token of health. Tokens might be a fresh sprig of rosemary or a scratch of charcoal on the palm. The weak or the frightened sometimes beg guards to let them pass. Rarely anyone does. You knock at the gate and show your mask and your staff. Only then do they lift a board so you can pass. A single door-to-door visit might require 3 such interrogations, and each costs precious time before the sun climbs too high. You pause to whisper a prayer at the edge of a garden. Roses bloom in a stone planter, though no one tends the flowers. A hand-drawn sign proclaims that the owner died yesterday. You brush your fingertips across a petal and leave a smear of dust on the bloom. You think of the medicine that once brought hope to that household. Now only the plague remains, knocking like a hidden guest at every door you visit. On some streets you find no locks on the doors. Families abandoned their homes in terror or fled on carts at first warning. Doors stand wide open, furniture thrown aside, bowls of leeks and beans left to rot. You step inside only if you must fetch a vial of water from the well in the yard. Rats scurry under debris and feast on scraps of gruel left in troughs. You raise your staff to herd them away. An iron pot hangs by a hook above the hearth. All that remains of human life in that house is a small loaf shriveled by heat. You leave the loaf where it lies and dash outside. Children peer from behind shutters when they see you. A single cough in your mask sends them scuttling into darkness. Some cling to their mother's skirts and press buttons of food to your staff in hopes that one scrap might stave off hunger. You shake your head gently and move on. You record the address and the names in your ledger. You promise to send bread or broth from the lazaret stocks. Weeks later, an orphan might find the meal in a bowl by the gate. That is the closest you come to compassion in your daily rounds. At midday, you reach the outer works where the poorest victims are housed. A ring of straw mats around a well-worn trough marks sleeping places. No walls contain them. They lie in the open air beneath a sky that offers no mercy. You watch as a dozen people huddle together, each too weak to stand. You lift your mask and wipe sweat from your brow. You untie a jar of ointment and smear it on a young man's neck where the bubo grows flattened by sweat. He moans and closes his eyes. You know that tomorrow he may not wake. Your own fatigue presses on you as the sun climbs high. Your boots ache from walking on stone and your legs cry for rest. But there is more to do. A family waits by the gate of their home. They have carried their father out so you can pronounce him dead. You examine the cold body and nod to the guard. The gate opens and you help to lift the corpse onto a stretcher. Later you will watch as it disappears in a cart, bound for the mass grave. You have begun at dawn, and already you have condemned more bodies than you would see in a single week as a country doctor. In the late afternoon, the wind shifts and carries a faint bird song from the fields beyond the wall. You pause with your staff planted in the earth. You breathe deeply and try to swallow down the memory of fear and of fever from your morning visits. You thank the sky for a moment of calm before turning back toward the gate. You still have one last door to visit before your round is done. You knock at the final cottage. No one answers at first. You knock again and call out a greeting. A child's voice whispers that they have no coin for your fee and no faith left to pray. The door creaks open and a grandmother stands there, hollow-eyed and trembling. She offers her chest for your stethoscope and begs for a drop of water. You press your staff to her back and nod. You pour a thimble of clean spring water into her cup. She drinks it as though tasting morning dew in a meadow. You jot a note in your ledger. You promise to return at dawn with fresh salve and a loaf of bread. You step back and raise your staff in farewell. The door closes softly behind you. You sense her eyes on your cloak as you walk away. You wonder if you will live to complete another day's round. You know that with every house you visit, you risk plague on your boots and in your lungs. Yet you press on, for you have chosen this path, and the plague doctor's duty never ends until the last bell tolls and the streets ring clear. Each morning you step beyond the safety of the quarantine gate and square your shoulders against fear. You cross the threshold into a town still under shadow of the plague. No street goes unmarked by illness. Each house you approach might hide fevered bodies and virulent coughs. The moment you lift a streaked lantern to knock on a door, you risk carrying infection back into the heart of your own refuge. You carry a sprig of rue in one hand and a small glass phial of vinegar in the other. Rue has long been thought to clear the air of miasma. Vinegar soaked in a rag over your nose may block corrupt vapors. Still, these charms do nothing against fleas that crawl through the doorframe or against droplets spat by a man gasping for breath. Each breath you draw, as you step from house to house, carries risk of plague slipping past your senses. Inside a cottage, you find a family huddled around a smoking brazier. The brazier burns resin to purify air. You cough at the acrid fumes, yet you accept the offered stool by the hearth. You lean your staff against the far wall and remove your mask only long enough to wet your lips. You gather water from a bowl on the table. Perhaps a single drop carries plague bacteria. Perhaps your empty mouth will draw that poison into your lungs and leave you trembling within hours. You turn to the patient who lies on a splintered bed. Their cheek is flushed, and their breath comes in rasping rasp. They clutch a blood-soaked cloth to a bubo beneath an arm. You reach forward with your staff to lift the flannel and find your cane tip brushed by a flea crawling to fresh flesh. The vision of that tiny creature makes your blood run cold. You pause, steady yourself, then press your lips to wipe the sweat from your brow. You know that each second in that room brings you closer to the same fate you came to heal. When you leave, you pause at the door and call out your blessing. A child peeks through a shutter and tosses you a crust of moldy bread. You drop it to the muddy street. You record the patient's name and their ailment in your ledger. Then you step away at a brisk pace. As you round the corner, you pull your staff free of a rat's tail and brush away fleas that cling to the wood. You spit onto the ground and wonder if that small act makes any difference. By midday, the sun climbs high, and the heat forces sweat down your back under layers of oil-treated cloth. You think of each open window you passed, each breeze that drifted beneath the mask, each gutter stream you sniffed at while fetching water. You sigh and wipe your brow, uncertain which moment carried the greatest risk. A single inhale of dripping roof moisture might bring plague. A single scratch behind your mask might let a flea enter to feast on your blood. At the next door, a sign warns of multiple deaths within. The door stands slightly ajar to admit fresh air. You step inside and find a single woman tending her husband. He lies on the floor, too weak to lift his head. His eyes follow you with fever glass. You kneel and offer a small vial of scented oil. The smell of bitter almond and cedar makes his nostrils flare, yet the relief lasts only moments. You know that oil will not chase away the bacteria in his blood. Each afternoon you navigate back toward the gate, haunted by faces of the sick. You note the addresses where no one answered. Perhaps the house holds only corpses. You wonder if you should force the door. You decide against it. You leave notes pinned to the threshold requesting aid from those too weak to move. Every second spent in that threshold increases your chance of carrying plague home. You return to the quarantine gate with your ledger full and your gourd half empty. Guards pull back a plank and call out your name. You slide into the yard and lock the gate behind you. You breathe freely for the first time all day. Yet you carry on your boots the dust of every street walked, and on your staff the fleas that never saw your cane. In the evening you remove your mask in a dark corner of the lazarette. You peer inside and see streaks of sweat on the leather. You untie the straps at the back of your head and feel the ache of the fit. You drop the mask onto a bench and watch fleas scatter from its rim. You breathe deeply without perfume for the first moment in hours, and feel tears burn at your eyes. Never once did your daily rounds bring certainty of safety. Each visit was a negotiation with a disease you could not name. Each knock on a shuttered door held the possibility of your own end. And yet you returned again and again, driven by duty and by the faint hope that a single cure might be found. If plague doctors met any success, it was only in bearing witness to suffering, and in recording every case for futures who might learn the truth behind the daily terror of those door visits. You step before the city council in your stained robe and beaked mask to negotiate your fee. A parchment lies upon the wooden table listing the terms for plague doctors. You expect gold coins in payment, but instead you find only a promise written in ink that may wash away in the next rain. Medieval towns measured wealth by grain stores and tax rolls more than by silver or gold. Few could afford to pay what you asked. Most offered only a token of appreciation or a share in the parish purse. Councils agreed to pay plague doctors by the day. A modest wage might be set at 2 pennies per visit or 6 pennies per week. You demand a higher sum for each house you enter. Few magistrates balked at adding a few more pennies because every saved life could return to labour in the fields or in the market. Yet when the council books were weighed, they often showed less than promised. Towns kept the difference to cover costs of guards and of fumigation. You left each meeting with lighter pockets and heavier heart. Private practice offered another path. Wealthy merchants or nobles summoned you directly. They paid a gilded coin purse for your attendance at a single estate. You stood before 3,000 acres of crops, or before a manor house humming with servants. In such places you commanded respect and coin in equal measure. Yet those who sent for you often fled at the first sight of plague. Your horses hawed at rotten air, and your staff clattered on marble floors. Within days the hall stood empty, and the rent remained unpaid. You found only cupboards bare, and a single silver chalice left behind as payment. Bartering served as currency in poorer districts. A farmer offered bushels of oats in exchange for your services. A tavern keeper gave barrels of brandy and salted fish. These goods could support you for a season, but did not last. You traded the oats for flour at the mill, and the brandy for wares at the market. You sold the fish for fresh vegetables when the plague peaked in summer. Each barter required a new round of negotiation and left you vulnerable to haggling and to questions about your worth. City charters sometimes established a fund for plague relief. Taxpayers added a levy to each transaction to support medical care. These communal treasuries sounded promising until the council used the money for other crises. Repairs to walls or to bridges often outranked disease in urgency. You watched the fund dwindle while you asked door to door for payment. In the end, you depended on your own slender purse and on the goodwill of neighbours. Social status weighed heavily on a plague doctor. In times of peace, you might hold a university degree in medicine or in natural philosophy. You taught at lecture halls and lectured on Galenic theory. Yet donning the beaked mask cast you among outcasts rather than saviours. People crossed the street at your approach. Children fled in terror. Priests avoided common ground for fear that your breath carried damnation. You became an object of fear rather than respect. The church showed ambivalence. Some bishops hailed your work as godly service. They wrote letters of recommendation for council meetings. They provided parchments that pardoned you from tithes and taxes. Other clergy condemned you as puppet of sin. They saw plague alone as divine judgment. They preached that no mortal should intervene. They barred you from church grounds and warned the congregation that your medicine opposed holy will. Guilds and surgeons eyed you with jealousy. Barbers who bled patients and who set bones sore in plague work a chance to expand trade. They sent envoys to councils to limit your practice. They argued that you lacked proper credentials. They demanded approval from the local guild whose rules you had never joined. You faced fines for practicing medicine without a fee paid to their coffers. Each lawsuit cost you more than a week's wage. Despite all these obstacles, you remained in demand. Towns desperate for any aid called you back season after season. Each appointment risked your life, but also offered a chance of coin. In some places, you found yourself admired once plague retreated. Children drew your masked profile on the walls. Nobles invited you to dinners to thank you for your service. Yet these honors came only after the worst had passed, and when the fear of contagion eased. Money and status returned only when you were out of danger. By the late years of your career, you carried no illusions. You learned that plague offered few riches. You paid for your own masks and robes at exorbitant cost. You repaired robes with patches of leather that cost more than your daily wage. You fed yourself on simple bread and broth, while the jars of ointment lay waiting on dusty shelves. You watched as bankers and as merchants fled the city, leaving behind empty shops and broken trusts. You remained among the poor, earning crumbs for your labor. When you finally ceased practice, you found no pension or reward. The city council offered a token gift at best. A sack of grain or a wheel of cheese marked their gratitude. Other doctors found themselves blacklisted from future employment. They were blamed for any outbreak that followed. In quiet taverns, talk went around that plague doctors sold more souls to the devil than they saved bodies for heaven. You look back on those days and wonder who paid the true price. Plague doctors placed themselves on the front line. They visited the sick at any hour. They recorded each case and drew conclusions that centuries later would inform science. Yet they earned little money. They faced social disgrace. They lived in fear of contagion and of retribution, and when it ended, they vanished into obscurity. Tonight, as you rest your weary bones, remember that only the desperate or the mad took this path. Only those willing to risk life itself could serve as plague doctors. Few could endure the meager fees, the fickle patronage, and the stench of death. To survive the plague required more than knowledge of medicine. It required courage to face each knock on the door and the strength to stand alone amid the fear of every neighbor. In that light, the few who wore the beaked mask deserve more than a moment's praise. They bore burdens that no fee could repay. You leave the council chamber with only a handful of coins tucked into your robe and the weight of 1,000 eyes upon your back. Each step toward the parish gate reminds you that the town sees you as both healer and harbinger of doom. Neighbors cross the street at your approach, and mothers pull their children inside. The beaked mask and cloaked figure frighten as much as they reassure. Your name is whispered in the alleyways where fear festers like rotting fruit. Guilds shun you for your strange attire and for daring to challenge accepted medical practice. Barbers and surgeons who once welcomed you in their halls now lock their doors. They accuse you of meddling in matters beyond your training. They claim your treatments spread plague rather than cure it. You lose opportunities to learn new techniques and to gain fresh insights from peers. Isolation becomes part of your daily routine. When you pass the local tavern, patrons bury their faces in ale and hide behind wooden beams. They say you spread contagion on your boots and that any handshake from you brings death. Even guards avert their eyes when you enter the courtyard. They pat your mask with a quick nod but refuse to meet your gaze. Where once you would have shared a bench and a bowl of stew, now you dine alone in a corner of the lazarette kitchen. The chatter of support you longed for falls silent. In the marketplace, you see your own image in a woodcut posted on a board. It shows you in full plague gear, a grim figure carrying a staff and a book of prayers. Below the image, townsfolk have added curses in chalk. They warn others to stay clear of your poison-filled mask. Children throw stones at the board and break glass vials hung beneath it as a mockery of your craft. You pass by without a word, though your heart twists at each shattered piece. Some families refuse your help, even when faced with death. A noble woman offered half a year's rent for a visit and turned you away at her threshold. She claimed you wore the mask as a sign of arrogance rather than compassion. A farmer's wife whispered that she would rather die in her husband's arms than face the gaze of your empty eyes. You record each refusal and tally them against those who plea for your skill. The count grows heavier than any ledger of coin. Yet among all this scorn, you meet a few brave souls. A widow offers you a bowl of fresh milk from her last surviving goat. She thanks you with tears in her eyes and speaks your name in a prayer. A master mason lifts his cap and bows when you cross his path. He calls you godsend and offers a measure of respect. Such rare moments of kindness remind you why you endure the stigma. You hold these tokens of gratitude close as you continue your rounds. Your reputation shifts with each wave of plague. In months when the sick flourish and death seems certain, your name is cursed in every street. But when the winds shift and new cases dwindle, the townspeople remember your efforts. They share stories of patients saved by your care and of fields tended again by those who returned to health. The same crowd that jeered now raises hymn verses in your honor. Yet this fickle applause offers only temporary shelter from scorn. Training often fails to protect you from envy and fear. Rich patrons hire surgeons and barbers over you because they can afford status and titles. They dismiss your credentials as inferior to those printed on vellum from the grand universities. You too once believed in parchments over practice. You earned your degree in a distant hall of learning. But the plague taught you that knowledge dies where arrogance lives. Now you carry your skills on your back as proof of value rather than on paper. As the seasons turn, you attend fewer houses and fewer pleas for help reach your ears. Then, the next storm of pestilence rises like a wave, and you are once again summoned at twilight. The pattern repeats, a rush of gratitude followed by weeks of enmity. You brace yourself for every swing of fate. You learn that survival does not rest on coin or on comfort, but on stubborn devotion to your calling. Each day you choose the mask and the staff over safety and solitude. In the years that follow, the plague doctor becomes a legend more than a profession. Few men survive the ordeal in body and spirit. You retire to a small cottage at the edge of town, your pockets still thin, but your heart relieved of daily terror. Scholars write treatises using your notes. They credit your perseverance with saving lives. They test new methods based on your records. Yet the memory of your lonely days among the sick remains hidden in dusty ledgers and faded pages. Tonight, as you reflect on your journey, remember this truth. Payment came in coin that vanished as quickly as the plague itself. Status arrived only when hope returned to the streets. Social stigma shadowed every visit and offered no shield when contagion struck home. Yet you persisted in your work, even when no one watched or praised. You walked those alleys and wielded your tools because you believed in a duty greater than fear. In that calling, you found a purpose that no stigma nor plague could erase. You stand before a fevered patient in a dimly lit chamber and prepare your instruments for bloodletting. A shallow basin gleams on the table, and beside it, a set of lancets lies poised. Bloodletting formed the backbone of medieval medicine. Doctors believed that illness arose from an imbalance of humors. Too much blood in the body meant fever and pestilence. To restore balance, you opened a vein and let the crimson flow until veins grew limp and the patient swooned. Yet with each draw of blood, you weakened a body already fighting infection. Patients collapsed from anemia and shock long before the disease could claim them. Cupping offered a gentler variation. You heated glass cups and pressed them against the patient's back. As the cup cooled, the skin rose into it like a blister. You moved cups across shoulders and chest until the skin brimmed deep purple. Patients hoped that toxins would gather in that swelling. Instead, the cups left bruises and open sores that invited bacteria. No vinegar wash cured the festering wounds. Within days, those cupped areas could rot and plague could enter through every pore. When bloodletting failed, you turned to cautery. You heated an iron in the flames until it glowed red, then pressed it against the flesh of a bubo or against the temples of a fevered head. Flesh crackled under the heat, and the acrid smoke stung your eyes. You believed fire would burn out the poison. In fact, cautery often drove bacteria deeper into tissue. The charred flesh sloughed off like ash, yet the infection thrived in the remaining wound. Without anesthesia, patients writhed in agony and often died of shock before the plague finished its work. Mercury stood as an exalted remedy for centuries. You prepared a paste of mercury sulfide and smeared it along the patient's gums or across the skin of the abdomen. Mercury was said to purge toxins through salivation and sweating. You watched as the patient's lips slurred and swollen salivary glands oozed fluid. Teeth loosened and gums bled. The brain fog that followed mercury treatment left patients dazed and incoherent. Some survived only to suffer kidney failure and tremors for the rest of their days. Theriac claimed the title of antidote for all poisons. This elaborate compound contained dozens of ingredients from vipers to myrrh and from opium to ambergris. You ground each component together and pressed the paste into small lozenges. Patients sucked on the lozenge as though tasting candy. They felt only nausea and a numbing of the tongue. When the bitter paste burned through the throat, it drove many to vomit. Instead of curing plague, the theriac often caused fatal dehydration. Each dose brought temporary dulling of pain, but almost certain collapse of strength. Poultices of fresh plants had their own risks. You crushed basil or mint and slathered the mash over the patient's chest or upon the buboes. The cool, wet mass soothed burning flesh for a moment, yet the damp paste drew rats and flies into the room. The insects feasted on the flavorful mix and spread larvae and disease within minutes. Patients whose sores grew welcome breeding grounds soon suffered secondary infections more lethal than the plague itself. At times you tried convalescent blood. You took a vial of blood from a recovered patient and mixed it with wine or broth. You believed that the curative blood carried antibodies that could fight the disease. You injected the mixture into a vein or poured it into the ear. Patients fainted at the sight of the rich red liquid. Many vomited hours later. None lived to see the benefits of another soul's survival. The practice only spread the pestilence as new vectors replaced the old. Enemas and clysters were common ways to evacuate the bowels. You mixed oil and herbs and poured the solution into the patient's rectum. You hoped to cleanse the body of poisons swallowed in tainted food or drink. Yet those remedies left patients weak and dehydrated. They collapsed on the table as the fluid poured out. Cramps seized the gut and left scarring in the bowels. Many excreted blood. The rush of fluid invited more pathogens to enter the body's interior. Fumigation with vinegar fumes offered another line of defense. You heated vinegar in a brazier and waved the vapor toward the sick. Patients coughed through the acidic fumes and gasped for fresh air. Yet the vinegary stench could not banish fleas or rodents. It merely caused tears to stream down faces and lungs to spasm with irritation. When true infection struck, the fumes offered only distraction from the rising fever. One final tactic was prayer and relics. You carried a small bone fragment of a saint in a silver reliquary and pressed it to the forehead of the dying. You said short prayers and dared to hope for divine intervention. Some patients claimed visions of angels. These moments of comfort offered no cure. Faith could not combat airborne plague, nor stop the bacteria that multiplied in each drop of blood. Each failed remedy taught a bitter lesson. Bloodletting bled patients to weakness. Cautery charred flesh only to leave deeper wounds. Mercury burned brain and bone. Theriac starved bodies with its bitter paste. Poultices and enemas carried new disease inside. Vinegar vapors only stung lungs. Saints' relics offered solace, but no cure. In the end, the plague doctor stood among the dying, with empty jars and broken tools. No remedy proved worth the hope that inspired it. Tonight, as you lay down your instruments, remember that every cure left its own scar. Medieval doctors worked with the best knowledge they had. They believed in theories passed down by ancient masters. Yet each treatment came with hidden costs and deadly consequences. It took centuries of suffering before science revealed the limits of these remedies, and before the world learned that true cures demand more than ritual and conjecture. You stand before another fevered patient and prepare your tools once more, though your confidence has waned. The litany of remedies you have tried weighs on your mind. Each treatment left its own mark of suffering. You wonder if any cure could be worse than the plague itself. Bloodletting proved so popular that every doctor carried a set of lancets and cups. You bled patients until their limbs grew weak and their voices ragged. But no matter how much blood you drew, the fever returned in full force. Your patients, hollowed by loss of vital fluid, sometimes slipped into delirium at the edge of death. You patched the wound with linen and vinegar, but sections of skin turned black from infection. When death followed, townsfolk whispered that your lancet betrayed them rather than helped. Cautery instruments lay cold on the table, yet you remembered their burn. You heated iron near the hearth until it glowed bright, then pressed it onto the festering buboes. Flesh sizzled and smoke curled upward, carrying the scent of charred tissue. You thought you grilled out the sickness, yet gangrene set in around each burn. Patients, barely conscious, clutched at the scarred flesh and cried at the pain. You dared not return to tend those wounds, and some died of the burns before the plague could finish its work. Mercury ointment sat heavy upon the shelf, toxic and sinister. You rubbed it into the gums of the sick, warned them that silver vapors would chase away poison. Instead, they vomited blood and shuddered beneath tremors. Their bones racked them as the heavy metal seeped into their organs. Some recovered only to live with trembling hands and a mind dulled by toxicity. No lancet or cup could extract the metal that burned them from within. Theriac, that legendary panacea, lay in a crystal jar bound with ribbon. A single dose contained the exotic dust of vipers and pearls, ambergris and opium. You dissolved a portion in wine and watched as the patient's eyes grew heavy with opiate slumber. They slept for hours and awoke only to find their strength drained. Their pulse beat too slow to sustain life. You found them cold at first light, victims not of the plague but of your own hope. Poultices of fresh herbs tempted you with promise. You crushed rose leaves and dock root into a damp paste and applied it to the patient's chest. They gasped at the cool moisture, at first soothed, then torn by rats drawn to the scent of damp green. The critters clawed at the paste and at the flesh beneath. By dawn, your patient lay covered in bites and sores, the herbal comfort replaced by festering infection and despair. Enemas and clysters might evacuate the bowels, but they also washed away nutrients and invited fresh pathogens. You forced a mixture of oil and herbs into the patient's rectum and watched as they convulsed with cramps. Many lost so much fluid that their eyelids sunk into hollow sockets. Some died of dehydration before the purge could cleanse the body of its invisible foe. Smoke fumigation offered a brief distraction. You burned juniper and wormwood in small braziers and passed clouds of scented smoke beneath each low door. Patients coughed through the acrid haze, tears streaming down their faces. The smoke sank into the sockets of their eyes, making them bleed. Their lungs grew inflamed by the heat. When the smoke cleared, they lay weakened, their bodies racked by fever and the sting of smoke ash. Guaiacum from the New World proved a fleeting marvel. You carried chips of the strange wood and mixed them into a boiling broth. You told patients this cure hailed from distant lands and carried the blessing of discovery. They drank the bitter tea in hope. Some found relief from the fever's edge. Others fell prey to allergic rash that covered their bodies in blistered sores. In the end, no vessel of Guiacum held enough miracle to slay the plague. You once tried iron rings bound in cloth soaked with vinegar, believing that pressing metal against the skin might dispel foul air through pain. Patients pressed the rings against their temples and moaned with each pulse. Some fainted from the pressure. You removed the rings quickly, lest you kill them outright. Pain alone could not wrest life from the grip of pestilence. Each failed remedy took its toll on your reputation and on the bodies of your patients. Townsfolk began to view each new treatment as a further step toward ruin rather than a path to healing. Mothers hid their children behind locked shutters. Fathers barred their doors to refuse entry to any doctor missing a proper credential. You found your path to each household blocked by suspicion and fear. In desperation, some patients turned to secret cults of healing. They paid charlatans who promised salvation through potions made of ground bone or of dried vipers. These charlatans sold trinkets made from painted wood or polished stone. Each claimed to ward off the plague with a single touch. Payments came in coins and in crops, but never in cures. The slick words of these impostors left patients weaker and poorer. Their last breaths were stolen by false hope, rather than by merciful relief. By the end of each day, you carried a heart weighed down by regret. Your table of instruments stood ready for practice, yet you knew that no implement of steel or of glass could outmatch the cunning of a tiny bacterium. Each drop of blood you drew, each burn you cauterized, each salve you applied only deepened your own sense of failure. You wondered how long you could endure bearing witness to so much suffering without succumbing to despair. Tonight, as you lay down your tools in an empty chamber, consider this truth. The remedies you offered in earnest belief often made illness worse. They opened wounds to infection, drained patients of life, and left the most vulnerable with no shield. It took centuries for science to uncover the true agents of plague and to create treatments that could actually save lives. Until then, each remedy remained a gamble with death, a ritual of hope that often ended in sorrow. You stepped from house to house bearing the stench of death and the weight of hope. Yet where once neighbors welcomed you now, they turn away in fear. Rumors swirl that plague doctors bargain with devils, that the beaked mask marks you as a bringer of poison rather than a healer. In the fever of panic, every death demands a culprit, and you, standing at the edge of life and death, become the perfect target for suspicion and rage. Accusations of witchcraft follow you through narrow streets. Mothers clutch their children close and whisper that you carry curses in your robes. Children hurl pebbles at your staff and shout warnings to flee before dark magic consumes them all. Villagers recall old tales of crones whose potions brought plague to farms, and they link those stories to your tinctures and salves. To them, the herbs in your pouch are no cure but ingredients in a deadly brew. Scapegoating spreads like the disease itself. When a new case appears by the old mill, the miller blames your passing footsteps. When a child is struck down by fever in the next valley, the miller's wife blames your silent prayers. Every cough among the healthy convinces market traders to empty their stalls rather than risk your contact. You leave behind you an empty marketplace, shuttered windows and angry faces pressed to glass. Violence soon grows from whispered threats. One night you return to the lazaret to find stones piled at the door. A crude sign nailed to the wood proclaims you an agent of the plague lord. Guards disperse the mob, but not before windows shatter and lamps are overturned. You lift your intact glass phial and slip it into your robe, knowing that at dawn someone will set fire to the gate or to the stacks of bedding inside. In one region, a local baron issues a warrant for your arrest. He accuses you of spreading plague through infected vials and demands retribution. You hide for days beneath piles of linen, your mask pressed against the wall while you list every tool in your kit as evidence against the charge. When you emerge, you find your name struck from the council rolls and your wages cut in half. Attacks grow bolder as hysteria peaks. Mobs chase you through the lane that leads to the old chapel. You flee into the church door and bow before a statue of the Virgin. The crowd pounds on the wood and hurls curses at your masked head. A single priest pleads for mercy, but his voice is lost amid the clamor of fear. You slip away through a side door and vanish before dawn. Even when law and order hold, social stigma leaves scars deeper than any blade. Neighbors once eager to offer bread now close their doors. Children who once ran to ask for an alms now hurl insults instead. You dine alone in the corner of your chamber, eating stale bread in silence. The candlelight trembles as you count the coins you have earned, and wonder if any of them are real or if they bear the taint of betrayal. By the end of the plague, your reputation changes again. Townsfolk remember those you saved, and offer thanks in hushed tones. They summon you from distant lanes to inspect survivors and bless the buried bones. They speak your name in prayer and carve your likeness in honored relief. Yet every act of gratitude carries a reminder of the weeks when you walked among them and they spat in your path. You learn that survival in this work depends on more than medical skill. You need allies among the wealthy, patrons who will defy the crowd to fund your cure. You must earn the trust of magistrates who will shield you from mobs and punish those who would harm you. You dress in sober colors rather than showy robes. You greet each challenge with calm words and clear eyes, rather than with arrogance or fear. In the memory of history plague, doctors stand as strange icons of toil and terror. They carried canes and masks to ward off death, yet became targets of rage when plague claimed their patients. They bore the blame for a disease they could neither name nor cure. In the end, they returned to anonymity or to lonely graves, their sacrifices forgotten until a new age of science shed light on the dark years of plague and superstition. The social backlash they endured remains a cautionary tale, that fear can turn gratitude to hatred, and that those who walk into danger risk not only disease, but the very wrath of the people they seek to save. You awake before dawn to the flutter of candle flame and the hollow echo of your own breathing. Each morning you brace yourself to step into the plague ward, heart pounding in your chest like a drum of warning. You know the moment you duck beneath the rope barrier, you trade safety for fear. Every cough in the corridor sets your nerves alight, as though you stood atop a gauntlet of blades. This dread accompanies you through every doorway, a shadow you cannot shake. Loneliness grips you even more tightly than terror. In the small chamber where you sleep, your only company is the quiet drip of vinegar in a bowl and the weight of your beaked mask hanging on a nail. No friend shares your pillow. No companion greets you in the corridor. The few nurses who tend the dying avert their eyes, as if your mere presence might condemn them to the same fate. When you return from your rounds, you find only silence waiting behind locked doors. At night, your dreams are stained with black blood and moaning breath. You see faces contorted by fever, bodies heaped like driftwood on the riverbank of death. You relive each horrible moment, the snap of brittle flesh, the hiss of cautery iron, the gurgle of fluid in the dying man's throat. You bolt upright in agony, gasping for air you cannot trust. The memory of those visions seeps into your waking hours. You flinch at any sudden noise, convinced for a moment that a patient lies dying nearby. Daylight brings no relief. You worry over every ache in your limbs. A simple headache becomes a premonition of demise. A shiver beneath your robes feels like the first stage of fever. You test your pulse with trembling fingers and find it racing as if caught in perpetual flight. Each sniffle in the street sends a jolt of panic through you. You convince yourself at times to flee the city walls forever, to abandon medicine and hide in a distant forest until memory of plague fades. Guilt follow you like a phantom. Patients you failed lie tangled in your mind. You blame yourself for every life you could not save. You recall the moment you chose one patient over another when supplies ran low. You replay that choice 1,000 times, each revision leaving you more haunted. No prayer can still the voice that whispers you might have done more, that you might have withheld no drop of blood nor bite of blistered flesh. Sleep eludes you, even when your body begs for rest. You wander long hours in fever dreams, searching corridors for a cure that will never arrive. You wake at last, your linen soaked with sweat, your heart lodged in your throat. You cannot lie still. You pace the floor until your legs ache. You hear every distant hoofbeat and imagine carts laden with corpses barreling down the street. You pull the blanket over your face and pray for dawn to break the spell of terror. In the small hours, you find your hands shaking with exhaustion and fear. You try to steady them with a swig of vinegar water, but the tang only burns deeper. You draw the curtains and peer into the empty yard. Mist drifts across the ground like hungry spectres. You press your palm to the cool glass and steel yourself to return at first light. Each morning you don your mask anew, despite every fibre of your being pleading to set it aside forever. Your colleagues succumb quietly. One falls to fever after months of service. Another vanishes overnight, leaving behind only her mask and staff. You hear they found her body in a field beyond the gates, her arms outstretched as though she sought solace in the open air. You run your fingers across her mask on the shelf and shudder at the thought of your own fate. Every loss among your band of doctors tightens the coil of despair around your heart. Coping mechanisms offer only fleeting respite. You whisper psalms in Latin beneath your breath to chase away nightmares. You drink diluted wine to calm your nerves, yet find it wakes the fever within you. You carve tiny crosses into the wood of your staff for protection, but the carvings fade beneath the grime. You toss and turn beneath the blanket until it falls to the floor, and you find yourself face down on the cold planks, tears wetting your cheek. You catch yourself speaking to the dead. In moments of weakness, you murmur a patient's name before you realize no one hears. You imagine their answer, a rasp of breath or a shake of the head, but you can hear only your own stifled sobs. You bury your face in your hands and wonder if you have become as lost as the dying souls you tended. You fear you may never find your way back to the world of the living. Occasionally, a moment of calm arrives, a lull between rounds when the street stands empty and the sun shines through a broken shutter. You step into that light and feel a whisper of hope. You press your face toward the warmth and let your guard down for a heartbeat. You imagine a life beyond the plague, a return to simple practice among healthy patients. Yet even as you taste that hope, it slips away, carried off by the memory of each cough and each hollowed cheek. By the end of the epidemic, you stand before the council again, mask in hand, asking to be released from your duties. You are gaunt, hollow-eyed, and trembling. They look upon you with pity and a spark of gratitude. They offer a small silver coin and a word of thanks. You pocket the coin and stagger away, the weight of every life and every death still pressing on your shoulders like a shroud. The scars of those years linger long after your mask is packed away. You jump at sudden sounds for the rest of your days. You wake in cold sweat at the memory of faces contorted in fevered pain. You cannot bear the sight of blood without flinching. Even in peaceful sleep, you find yourself running door to door, calling names that no longer answer. The psychological toll of being at the forefront of plague leaves wounds deeper than any blade. You learn that some duties, once taken up, never let you go. When the plague swept through the towns, it did more than claim lives. It shattered the fragile hierarchy of healers and exposed deep rivalries among physicians and practitioners. At the top sat university-trained physicians. They held degrees in the theories of Galen and Hippocrates and wore robes of velvet trimmed with fur. They believed that only their knowledge of ancient texts could guide treatment. Yet when pestilence spread, their dusty tomes offered little help. Patients they pronounced healthy, 1 hour lay dead the next. The failures of the learned soon became public spectacle and the authority of the physician began to crumble. Below them stood the surgeons. These were practical men who learned in apprenticeship and in battlefields rather than in cloistered lecture halls. They wielded knives and cautery irons, and earned reputations for setting broken bones and draining abscesses. When physicians debated the nature of miasma and humours, surgeons stripped down for their work and showed skill at opening bubbos. Town councils often turned to them when the learned doctors faltered. Yet, surgeons lacked the social standing of physicians. They clashed bitterly over jurisdiction. Physicians accused surgeons of butchery. Surgeons scorned physicians as men who could not suture a wound without the aid of a servant. Barber surgeons occupied an even lower tier. They cut hair and beards, bled patients, and performed minor surgeries. They charged affordable fees and served as first responders in small villages. In times of plague, they found themselves in demand. Their shops became makeshift infirmaries. Yet, elite physicians viewed the barbers as charlatans. Barber guilds defended their members, insisting that no doctor could set a dislocated joint without the steady hand born of cutting hair. Each license to practice carried a tangle of fees and endorsements. Rival petitions to the council created chaos. Plague doctors found themselves caught between guild charters and university decrees. Into this vacuum rushed wandering healers and quacks. They sold theriac and powders made of viper skins. They carried portraits of saints and claimed miraculous cures. Some offered saltwater baths heated in cauldrons, others dabbed garlic, infused oil on the skin. Their cures varied from the ingenious to the absurd. Yet in the darkness of fever, dreams, and at the edge of death, even the most desperate families clutched at any hope. When these healers sometimes reported a patient recovered, they became folk heroes. But when too many succumbed, they were tarred with the same contempt as the learned physicians. City councils struggled to maintain order among these contesting practitioners. In some towns, the council issued edicts restricting practice to those with letters of recommendation from the local medical faculty. In others, they granted special commissions to barber surgeons to serve in the plague wards. Each decree triggered a fresh round of appeals and counter-petitions. Magistrates spent more time mediating arguments over turf than in organizing effective relief. The people clamored for protection while the healers fought for status. In those days, no law could bring order to a profession at war with itself. The guild system added to the friction. Barber surgeons formed guilds to protect trade secrets and to regulate entry. Physicians formed confraternities tied to the universities. Each guild demanded fees for apprentices and for licenses. An outsider seeking to practice faced a gauntlet of tests and dues. When the plague hit, councils exempted plague doctors from some fees but required others to pay extra for travel and for quarantine. This patchwork of privilege bred resentment. Members of one guild accused the other of breaking oaths and of profiteering from death. The public watched dismay turn to disgust. As mortality soared, the public faith in all medicine crumbled. Neighbors whispered that no doctor or barber could save their friends and kin. Families refused to pay the fees demanded for consultation, deciding instead to rely on prayers, charms, or flight from the city. Some turned to the church for solace, others to folk rituals that promised protection if they sacrificed a key or a ring. Trust evaporated. When a practitioner entered the street, people fled or barred their doors. The healer's coat, once a sign of hope, became a banner of dread. High-profile conflicts underscored the collapse. In one city, a famous university doctor publicly sued a barber surgeon for practicing beyond his station. The surgeon replied with his own lawsuit, charging the physician with unlawful treatment that killed a nobleman. The courts never resolved the matter. Meanwhile, both men left town when a new outbreak struck. In another village, a plague doctor was lynched by a mob, convinced he had sold poison to wealthy merchants. The council exonerated him posthumously, but never repaid his family. These dramas revealed that, in a time of fear and death, authority meant little. By the end of the great epidemics, the social order had shifted. Surgeons gained recognition for their practical skills. Barber surgeons won formal licenses to bleed and to remove buboes. Physicians clung to their degrees but lost the monopoly on healing. The rise of new colleges of surgery in cities recognized the need for trained hands over ancient texts. Yet it would take decades before science and clinical observation replaced guild rivalry and ancient theory. Public health would emerge only after centuries of bitter lessons learned in the crucible of plague. In the ruins of collapsing authority lay the seeds of modern medicine. The failures of physicians, surgeons, and barbers drove a search for better knowledge. New schools taught anatomy through dissection. Hospitals were founded to study disease rather than to contain it. The bitter struggle for status gave way to collaboration, as healers realized that unity offered more hope than division. Though tragedy claimed countless lives during the plague, it also forced the medical world to confront its divisions and to build a framework that could withstand the next great challenge. When the scourge finally eased and the dead lay buried in shallow pits, a handful of plague doctors emerged from the haze of fear and grief. Some found their names inscribed on town gates and in parish records. They received gifts of land or letters of thanks from grateful rulers. A few wrote treatises on their experiences that survived in libraries across Europe. Their words offered future generations a window into the darkest hours of human suffering and the first stirrings of scientific inquiry. One such doctor returned to his native city with a purse heavy from royal reward. He built a chapel to honor the saint whose relic he carried through quarantined streets. His portrait adorned the town hall next to images of military heroes and great merchants. Children still point to the carved figure on the chapel lintel and speak his name with reverence. His stories passed down through the centuries inspired respect for the healer who faced death unflinchingly. Another survived by fleeing the worst afflicted quarters and by tending to the wealthy merchants who could pay in coin and in cloth. His reputation among the elite granted him a seat at the governor's table. He advised on public health measures and on the building of new wells and sewers. In time, he served as the first dean of the College of Physicians in his region. His lectures formed the basis of a new curriculum that took shape long after the miasma theory fell away. Yet for every doctor who found a claim, dozens vanished without a trace. Their names appeared briefly on contracts and on ledgers that recorded daily visits. When they died or moved on, no one updated the records. Their tools lay rusting in attics, their notes rotted in damp chests. Local historians found only fragmentary references to wandering healers. In towns that once rang with the bell of the plague ward, now only weeds burdened the ground where the Lazaretine walls once stood. Civic pride did little to preserve the memory of most healers. When chroniclers turned away from the grim tally of deaths, they left little space for those who strove to save life. Parish clerks drafted bills of mortality without ever listing the doctors who bore witness to the carnage. Registers recorded the name of the deceased, but not of the man who knelt at their side and applied the salve of violet and vinegar. Without land or title, their service faded into oblivion. A few wrote personal accounts to gain a measure of immortality. Their diaries detailed each house visit, the progression of buboes, and the dances of rats beneath floorboards. They described the clash of sword and cane in doorways when mobs turned violent. These manuscripts circulated among learned circles and eventually reached the printing press. Scholars translated them into Latin and into French and into English. Their names endure in footnotes and in the margins of medical history texts. Most, however, left no written record. Their work amounted to a series of knocks on empty door frames. They carried no purse of gold and received no pension from the city. When they fell ill, they died quietly in solitude, abandoned by those they served. Their bodies joined the mass graves and the common pit. No stone marked their resting place. Their families, if they survived, moved away to escape the memories of loss. The contrast between fame and forgetfulness hinged on circumstance and on social station. A doctor who served a noble household might find a portrait painted, and a poem composed in his honor. A doctor who served the poorest suffered the disdain of both the community and of the elite. When he died, only his peers would notice his absence. His gravestone, if ever erected, bore only a name and no epitaph of gratitude. For the few who survived the epidemics intact, life after service took many forms. Some retired to their estates and turned to study. They planted herb gardens and taught apprentices. They married late and raised families with the hope that no child of theirs would know the horror of the plague. Their descendants inherited small fortunes and never asked too many questions about how the wealth was earned. Others found themselves in demand when the next wave arrived. Plague never fell silent for long. New outbreaks in other cities called for experienced hands. These doctors traveled in caravans across mountains and through crowded ports. They taught local barbers how to use their staff and how to pack the beak of the mask with herbs. Their reputation preceded them. Doors opened at their knock, but the fear in the eyes of the sick remained a constant reminder of the peril ahead. A few crossed into distant lands, seeking refuge from blame and rage. They carried letters of safe conduct from one city council to the next. They set up practice in foreign courts and won the favor of princes who valued new remedies. They encountered different customs and different diseases. In the Levant, they faced fevers of another kind and learned from Arab physicians who traced contagion to water streams and to rodents. Their work laid the foundation for a more global perspective on disease. Most plague doctors, however, knew the bitterness of failure. They stitched buboes and drew blood until their hands shook. They saw families torn apart and villages emptied of life. When the dead outnumbered the living, their efforts felt as futile as ant steps against a deluge. Some abandoned medicine altogether, haunted by the cries of the dying and by the sight of rats feasting on open sores. They turned to the church or to teaching children. They never spoke again of their years in service. Communities that once called them heroes later accused them of negligence. When survivors wanted explanations for why they had lived and their neighbors had died, they pointed at the men in beaked masks and asked what remedy had truly made a difference. The doctors offered modest truths that science would only confirm centuries later, but the memory of their failures fueled gossip. They became scapegoats for the collective guilt of a people who had watched death claim friend and foe alike. In the end, the legacy of plague doctors remains a mixture of reverence and forgetfulness. Some shine in the annals of history as pioneers of public health and as brave souls who stared down death. Most remain lost to time, their faces unknown and their tools scattered in anonymous sheds. Their service played a crucial role in the slow birth of modern medicine, even as their names slipped beneath the waves of oblivion. Tonight, as you contemplate their fate, remember that true service often goes unsung and that survival does not guarantee renown. The few who emerged as celebrated figures carried burdens that no gold could ease. The many who vanished into darkness stood at the front lines of humanity's greatest crises and received neither thanks nor memorial. And yet both groups, in life and in death, shaped the course of healing and of hope in an age when hope itself seemed extinct. Over time, the figure of the plague doctor slipped free of its historical context and took on a life of its own in story and image. In the centuries after the great epidemics, artists stumbled over the strange silhouette of the beaked mask and flowing robes. They pressed the shape into woodcuts and etched it onto funeral broadsheets. The odd costume became shorthand for death itself, a winged spectre that whispered doom in every alley. In folk memory, the plague doctor took on qualities of both healer and harbinger. Peasants told tales of a lone doctor wandering through fog at midnight. They claimed that if you glimpsed the lantern in his hand, you had only hours to live. Mothers frightened their children by saying the doctor would come for the unwary. These stories painted the doctor as an omen more than a man of science. His mask became a skull, and his cane an instrument of arrest rather than of aid. Printmakers sold images of the doctor to travelers and to curious folk who flocked to plague shrines. These crude prints bore no names and no dates. The only thing certain was the black masked face and the empty glass eyes. Collectors clipped the prints and pasted them into journals alongside drawings of devils and demons. The plague doctor became an understudied piece of the nocturnal world, a figure just beyond the line of dreams and nightmares. In carnival celebrations, the doctor's costume found a new role. Revelers donned the mask to mock the spectre of death, even as they carried flasks of wine and caroused in the streets. At those masked balls, the beaked figure danced alongside jesters and harlequins. The festival took the sting from the coat of oil-treated cloth and the glass goggles. The plague doctor became a playful reminder that no terror could endure when folk took to laughter at the dusk of fear. In literature, the doctor drifted between villain and savior. Early tales cast him as a misguided fanatic who spread poison under the guise of cure. A 17th century pamphlet told of a doctor who ground snakes into his ointments and drank mercury to prove his own immunity. In those pages, the doctor was an alchemist of agony whose treatments killed more than the plague itself. Readers shivered at each recipe and locked their doors at midnight. Later novelists reclaimed the doctor as a tragic hero. They gave him a backstory of loss and devotion. In those tales, he witnessed his family fall to the fever and swore to risk his own life to save others. His beaked mask became a symbol of sacrifice rather than of menace. Readers wept at his loneliness and cheered at his courage. The doctor's legend became a parable of duty in the face of despair. Folklore also spun ghost stories around plague doctors. Travelers claimed to see figures in black robes drifting through abandoned villages. They said the doctor would bend over a shuttered window as though checking for life. Some spoke of the lantern's light glowing cold blue in the mist. These stories spread along trade routes, adding to the doctor's reputation as a watcher from beyond the grave. Camps of soldiers whispered the tales around fires, and the doctor became a phantom of memory rather than history. In modern times, the plague doctor reigns as an icon of dread. Horror films and graphic novels depict him as a villain, with surgical tools glinting in moonlight. Video games cast him as a monster to be defeated, or a guide through plague-ridden lands. His mask appears on posters advertising haunted houses, and on t-shirts sold in tourist shops. The face that once hid the pain of men struggling to heal now stares back at us as the face of fear. Collectors prize authentic 17th century masks in museum vaults. Students of history marvel at the craftsmanship of leatherwork and the faint scent of herbs that lingers in the beak. Curators mount exhibitions on medieval medicine and place the mask in a glass case under dim lights. Visitors gape and whisper about the power of the mask. They read the placard and walk on, leaving behind only footsteps and the echo of a time when hope needed a mask to stand against terror. Even as the doctor became a staple of myth, scholars tried to untangle fiction from fact. They combed archives for contracts, for city council minutes, for parish accounts that named plague doctors and their fees. They cross-referenced the handful of signed treatises to confirm details of costume and of practice. Yet for every document that surfaced, dozens more remained lost in the ashes of burned libraries or in the margins of yellowed ledgers. The real men who wore the mask slipped through history like smoke. In street art, the doctor's mask returns as a symbol of dread and defiance. Graffiti artists spray the outline on crumbling walls. Protesters wear it as a mask against surveillance, or as a sign of solidarity with those who face danger in crisis. The beaked face is repurposed as a statement of rebellion against forces that prey on fear. Each new reuse reshapes the myth. The figure of the plague doctor stands at the crossroads of history, medicine, and art, always ready to change with the needs of the hour. Through legend and through myth, the plague doctor remains an enduring emblem of human confrontation with disease and with dread. The twisted stories of witchcraft and of ghostly images remind us how easily fear can reshape truth. Yet for every tale told in shadow, there lies the memory of a healer who once walked through burning homes and bleeding streets. The mask they wore became a mirror of our own terror and of our courage when the world seemed broken by plague. And in that reflection we discover the real legend of service born from suffering and of myth born from the human heart's need to make sense of darkness. By the time the plague doctor laid down his book and removed his mask for the day 80, last time he carried wounds, no salve could heal. He had faced endless hazards that began at dawn and only slackened when night stole his breath. His tools of trade sickened those he touched. His cures left the living more hollow than the dying. His protective gear offered little barrier against flea or droplet. Each day he signed his name to another chapter of horror. When you add up the risks of contagion, the cruelty of remedies, the weight of stigma, and the collapse of authority around him, it becomes clear that only the mad or the desperate could ever take the oath to serve. First came the threat of infection. No mask of leather, nor gown of waxed cloth could stop the plague bacterium carried on fleas, or the cough of a fellow human. Every door-to-door visit risked one scratch of cloth, or one inhaled droplet too close to the nose. He breathed in the stench of death itself, day after day, until he knew the taste of putrid air in every breath. He watched patients' bodies give way from buboes and fevers. He tended wounds that ran black with gangrene. He noted each failure in a ledger of sorrow. Then there were the remedies that made things worse. He drew blood until his patients slumped in shock. He burned flesh in the hope of driving out poison, only to spread infection through cautery wounds. He dosed mercury that rotted brain and bone. He forced bitter lozenges of theriac until patients could swallow no more. Each treatment was a gesture born of faith in ancient theory. Each gesture left its own scar, and the plague marched on unconcerned. Social backlash took its own toll. Villagers cursed the plague doctor as a witch or as an agent of the devil. Mothers barred their children's doors. Mobs assembled in the streets with torches and stones. He hid in the dark, his mask glinting in torchlight, his heart pounding with every step. At council meetings he begged for support and payment, yet found only suspicion and broken promises. When violence forced him to flee a town, he left behind shattered windows and overturned carts of bedding. Peer rivalry worsened the burden. University-trained physicians blamed the barber surgeon who dared to lance buboes. Surgeons derided the physician who refused to set bones. Barber surgeons fought to protect fees for bloodletting. Councils issued conflicting edicts. Each group claimed superior method and vilified the rest. As authority fractured, towns turned to flagellants, to charlatans, even to mass flight. The plague doctor found himself cast adrift in a sea of discord, with no guiding hand to steady the course. Loneliness and fear gnawed at him in the small hours. He carried nightmares of coughing faces and blackened flesh into every day. He woke, dripping with sweat, to the echo of distant bells tolling death. No colleague offered comfort. No neighbor offered bread. He ate by candlelight in a corner of the lazarette kitchen and studied his shaking hands. He wondered how long his heart could bear this weight. Many doctors succumbed to madness or fled their oaths altogether. Payment rarely matched the peril. Councils promised pennies per house and a small share of grain. Merchants who could pay fled at first knock. Bartering for firewood or for onions left him poorer than the patients he visited. No pension awaited him at the end of service. No monument stood to mark his valor. If he survived, he stowed his mask in an attic and hoped to forget the smell of vinegar and of death. Yet memory would not let him go. Only the mad or the desperate took this oath. They who feared nothing more than the silence of abandoned streets. They who craved purpose even at the risk of life and sanity. They who believed that service to suffering was its own reward. In the end, the plague doctor stood at the edge of history, a figure of horror and of courage entwined. His legacy lies not in his cures, but in the oath he kept under the darkest sky, and in the knowledge that true healing demands sacrifice beyond measure.